Hello. In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this game in Godot 3.2. It's a really simple game and works pretty much exactly like the Google Dinosaur game. You have a character and you run around and try to jump over obstacles. And the longer you manage to jump over them, the higher your score gets. Until eventually you jump into an obstacle and you die. Yeah, that's basically the same principle, except that I took lots of assets from Pusheen and made it a whole lot cuter. So let's hope I don't get sued. And I will create all of it in the game engine Godot and with the language GD script, which is similar to Python. So if you know a little bit of that or really any programming language, you should be able to follow this tutorial series quite easily. But none of the concepts are difficult. So even if you are completely new to programming, you should be able to follow. I'm not sure just yet how many videos it will take to make the whole game. So let's just get started by talking about what Godot is and how it works. Godot is a game engine, which basically just means it's a program that helps you organize different kinds of assets. Those could be pictures, sounds, 3D models, or code. And you put them together in such a way that you are getting a game out of it. Some really famous game engines that you might have heard of are Unity, Unreal, and GameMaker. And they all work in fairly similar ways. If you know one, you can learn another really easily. Godot is a pretty new game engine actually, and not quite as developed as the more established ones, but it is open source and completely free to use, and it is a really nice way to start learning about game development and programming in general. You can download Godot from godotengine.com or from Steam. Both versions are identical, except that the Steam version gives you some template games you can look at. I will stick to the version from the website, and after downloading and unzipping it, you just need to click on the icon and it should start. If that one works, you have successfully installed Godot, and the first thing you should see is the project manager. This one does what the name implies. It manages your projects. And it's also the place where you create new projects. Since we just installed Godot, it is completely empty. So let's create one by clicking on New Project. And now we need to decide a few things. Number one is the name of the project. I'll call mine JumpCat. But the name really doesn't matter, so choose whatever you like. Number two is where we want to save all the files that we create. And Godot will create a new folder and store all of your data in it. I will create a new folder in the default location, which is in Documents. The final thing Godot wants to know is whether we want to use OpenGL 2 or 3. You don't really need to know what either of those mean in detail. Basically, OpenGL is what Godot uses to display all the content. I will stick with the default one, which is OpenGL 3. But it doesn't really matter all that much. And that's all we needed. So I click on Create and Edit, and that brings us to the engine itself. And there's quite a lot of stuff to cover. So let's talk about how all of this works. When you first start Godot, you can see 4 windows. And I think it's going to be easier to explain all of them with some actual content. Alright then, so the big thing in the middle we see, it's called the Viewport. And that's where we can see our actual game. And this one is quite straightforward. You see lots of elements and together they make the game. And you can pan around here by just holding the middle mouse button and just moving it around. And in my case, I don't really have that much to show. I have a background, a picture of a cat, and some more elements that don't matter too much just yet. And yeah, then you can select elements and move them around. And as usual, Ctrl-Z returns it to normal. Then at the top of the viewport, there are some more elements that we're going to see later. They don't matter too much just yet, but they will become a bit more important later on. What's going to matter for now a bit more are these elements at the top. We have 2D, 3D, script, and asset lib, which is short for asset library. And yeah, they basically do what they say. So you have the 2D viewport, the 3D viewport, which is empty right now because we don't have any 3D elements. And then we have the script. This is where you have all the code. And then finally we have asset library where we can download additional stuff. Yeah, there's some additional stuff that can be quite useful, but for our purposes, we just don't really need it. So I will stick to script and 2D for this entire tutorial series. So 3D and asset library you can just ignore entirely. And one really useful thing is you can switch these around with the F keys. So F1 is 2D, F2 is 3D, F3 is script. and I will use those quite a bit. And that makes it much easier to switch around between the two. But yeah, so for the next one, let's say I just click on the main player character, so Pusheen, or the cat. And then we can see two more things happening. So first one, on the left, over here, we have an inspector. And what this one does is that it gives us all the attributes of this element that we have selected. So for example, I could click on transform and move it around, for example. Moves very slowly, but I could just type in a larger number, let's say 600, and it would move it to the right. So this is one attribute. Could also scale it and make it look really strange. And there's lots more stuff in here. And we can influence all of these elements in code as well, which is really, really useful later on, and basically how we're going to run most of the game. So yeah, this one is going to get really important. On the other side, on the left, we have our scene tree. And this one is going to get quite important in terms of how we understand how Godot works. So let's talk about Godot a bit more in detail in terms of how it works and what it does. And that brings us to a core concept of Godot, and that is scenes and nodes. The way Godot is organized is that you have a scene that contains lots of different elements, and each element is represented by a node. If you think of a theater, you would have a stage, and on that stage you could put all sorts of things, like actors, decorations, lights, audio equipment, and lots of other stuff. In this analogy, the stage itself is a scene, and each thing you put on the stage is a node. A node could contain a picture, it could play some music, it could contain text, or it could be a placeholder. Godot has a few hundred different nodes that basically cover anything you could ever need. And all the nodes you use in a scene you can see on the panel in the left. And if you click on one, it also selects the node you have in the viewport. One thing that is quite important here is the order of the nodes. You always have a node at the root of the scene, and each additional node is a child of that original node. The original node would be called a parent, and the added node is a child. And if you made changes to the parent node, this would also affect the child node. And you can add as many parent-child combinations as you want. And you could even add another child to the child you already have. Since it is called a node tree, think of an actual tree. If you move the branch, you would also move the leaves on that branch. And if you chop down the entire tree, it would affect all the branches. I will cover all of this in much more detail later on. What is more important for now is that each node can do lots of different things. The most direct way you can make them do stuff is by attaching a script to them. You could either give each node a script by itself, or you could use the script on one node to influence another node. You can see if a node has a script by the icon next to it. And if you click on it, you can see all the code that is on the node. We will actually spend most of our time with the code, because this is where all the interactivity happens. And another thing you can do with the nodes is to have them communicate with each other. We have signals and groups. Both of these are used to get nodes to communicate with each other. A signal is emitted by a node with a specific target in mind, so it's kind of like sending a text message. A group is more like a radio broadcast, where you emit a signal on a certain frequency that everyone on that frequency can hear. And each group would be a frequency in that analogy. And those are the basic elements you always need. The few remaining ones are quite simple. At the bottom left, we can see the file system. This is where we store all of our files, and it shows the content of the folder we created just a few minutes ago. So if you want to import a new file into Godot, you just need to drag it into that folder. And the final part is above all the windows. On the top left, you have some menus that can influence the project itself, like your frame rate and the resolution of the game. And on the top right, you get some buttons that actually start the game. The most important one is the play button. That one launches the actual game, or at least a preview of that. Those buttons can also be used with the F keys. And with that, we have a basic overview of how Godot works and its UI. And just to emphasize the really important bit, on the main viewport you see a scene. And a scene is basically the stage that your game is displayed on. And each element of that scene is a node, and each node has plenty of attributes that you can influence. You can have the nodes communicate with each other with signals and groups, and you can give each node a script to make it do specific things. Alright, Before I finish this video, there's one more thing I want to talk about. And I haven't mentioned this yet because it breaks the analogy of the theater stage a little bit. So basically, you can put one scene into another scene. And this is obviously not something you see in the theater, but in Godot it's an incredibly powerful concept that you also see all the time. So for example, in the game, the player cat itself is its scene by itself. And if you click Ctrl-Shift-O, you can see all the scenes, and I have loads. And even some that I didn't end up using in the end. But if I just click on the main player itself, that has lots of different elements, and I put the entire scene into the main scene of the game. And in the node tree, you just need to look at this little icon that you can see that this scene comes from another place. So this is a scene inside of a scene. And if you click on it, you get the scene itself. And in this game, not only is the player cat itself a scene in itself, but when I run the game, anytime we see an object coming in, this is also a scene by itself. And you can't see this in this node tree because when I create them while the game is running. So they're created by the code and you can only see them once the game is running. But basically anything you see in the game is a scene in itself. So anything that flies, anything that is an obstacle is a new scene. So we have one main scene and we instance a lot of new scenes into it. And the main reason for doing it is that it makes the game much easier to work with. So think of each scene as its own folder with lots of content in itself. And this allows us to work on very specific things one step at a time, which makes especially larger projects so much easier to work with. So instead of the theater analogy, think of scenes as folders. And nodes are just stuff you put inside of the folders. And then you can also just put a link to another folder inside of a folder. And this is what you see very, very often in Godot. So that's a really important concept. Don't forget that one. And with that, you should have a basic understanding of how the interface and logic of Godot works. But yeah, this wasn't exactly exciting. So in the next video, we're actually going to start working on the game itself. And what we're going to start making in the next video is going to be the cat jumping in the void. So I'll see you then.